Well, okay then. Seems like we got another spicy Jesus alert here, folks. If it wasn't hot enough for you outside, I'm so glad that we could warm things up right here in the sanctuary. As I mentioned, we've got another agricultural parable. Right on the heels of last week's story, where Jesus was talking about the sower and the different types of soil, comes this famous parable about the wheat and the weeds, which some of you might know better as the parable of the wheat and the tares. Jesus included all of these metaphors about farming, agriculture, taking care of sheep and goats, and fishing, because those were the most common professions of the people who would have been listening to his teachings. And Jesus understood the importance of taking the complex theological concepts that he was trying to convey and putting them in terms that people could understand. Now, just because he tried to put them in relatable terms, however, doesn't mean that Jesus' parables are always easy to figure out. And that's kind of the point. Parables are meant to be ambiguous, open to interpretation. It's one of the reasons that these stories have remained relevant and applicable to people's lives for nearly 2,000 years after they were first told. So it's a little odd that Jesus, both in last week's reading and in today's reading, decides to demystify a perfectly good parable and explain exactly what he means. Honestly, it kind of takes the fun out of it a little bit. It's like flipping to the back of the book to check what the answer is before you've even spent a minute wrestling with the question. Now, I also don't love it because, and here I'm not even sure I'm allowed to say this, but I don't fully agree with Jesus' explanation of this story. But before we get into me being a heretic for disagreeing with Jesus, let's take a closer look at what he said. Jesus sets the scene by saying that the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a field where someone went and planted good seeds, but while everyone was sleeping, someone else came in and planted weeds. Now, I'm not sure if this was like a rival farmer situation or a prank or what, but I'm kind of getting some like Looney Tunes-esque vibes here. I'm picturing this masked, fedora-wearing bandit character who's tiptoeing into the field, planting these seeds and twirling his mustache with malicious glee, which may or may not have been, the image Jesus was going for. But again, the beauty of parables is that they are open to interpretation. Anyway, once the plants begin to spring up and the workers see what's happened, they are upset. They go to the master and they say, "We thought you planted good seeds. You better go back to the feed store to get a refund because you got scammed." And then they offer to go out and do some weeding, but the master tells everyone to just chill and wait until the harvest, at which time the wheat will be gathered into the barn and the weeds will be bundled together to be burned. In Jesus' explanation, which you'll note was said only for the benefit of the disciples, which is interesting. But Jesus explains that in this parable, he is the master, the one who planted the good seed. He said that the wheat represents the children of the kingdom, while the weeds represents the children of the evil one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil, and at the end of the age, the angels will separate the good from the bad, casting the weeds into the fiery furnace, and then he caps it all off with that oh so dramatic phrase where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, despite not loving this parable and Jesus' explanation of it for reasons I will soon get into, I will say that there are some things that I resonate with in terms of how it depicts the world in which we live. In Genesis, we are told that God created the world and everything in it. And at the end of each day, God looked upon all that had been created and declared it to be good, save for humankind, which was the only creation that God's quality control office deemed to be very good. But all this begs the question then, if God only created good things and very good people, why is there so much pain and suffering and evil in the world? Why are there some people who cause hurt and harm to other people? Those weedy people, those bad seeds. I'm sure that some specific names will pop into your head if I let you sit and think long enough. People who, in our less grace-filled moments, we wouldn't mind seeing plucked from the field and tossed into the compost heap, which is the more eco-conscious version of the unquenchable fire, since Jesus didn't have to contend with the same wildfire risks that we have here in Southern California. But where did they come from? Well, this parable attempts to answer that very question. And when you take it all together, it's easy to see how this story, along with others, led theologians to develop the traditional understandings of things like heaven and hell and the devil. These good seeds that grew into the wheat, well, they will get to climb that stairway to heaven that Led Zeppelin talked about and enter into God's great granary in the sky. Whereas the children of the evil one, the bad seeds, the weedy evildoers, well, they get a one-way ticket on AC/DC's highway to hell. Author Dorinda Jones once quipped, "The fact that there's a highway to hell and only a stairway to heaven says a lot about anticipated traffic numbers." But all jokes aside, given Jesus' explanation of this parable, things seem pretty straightforward. Good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. God made all that is good and the devil made everything bad. It's all so neat and tidy, clear and concise, which is exactly what bothers me about it. Because when have Jesus' stories ever been neat and tidy, clear and concise? Aside from a few instances, that is not generally how he operated. He was much more about nuance, about finding the grace, the gray areas, speaking in ways that made people think, as opposed to simply handing them an answer on a silver platter. And then consider some of the other details about this explanation. Have any of you ever actually met someone who was 100% evil, or 100% good, 100% wheat, or 100% weed? No, even the greatest saints have had their weedy moments, and the parallel is true for even the most egregious of sinners. And where does free will factor into all of this? Just like the soil from last week, the seeds in today's story have no control over their own nature. Both the good seeds and the weedy seeds are destined to grow based solely on their genetic makeup. They have no control over what they will become, and therefore no control over whether they are bound for the granary or for the fiery furnace. Does that mean that we are either born good or evil, and that there's nothing that we can do about it also? And if there's nothing that we can do about it, if God has already worked out who is going to heaven and who is going to hell, then what's the point? And furthermore, where does the grace and the love and the forgiveness that Jesus is always talking about factor in here? This story is so cut and dry. And while on the surface it might seem like a good explanation for the nature of the world, once you get in there and start asking questions, start pulling strings, it begins to unravel a little bit. Now, I know I just threw a lot at you. A lot of really big questions about the nature of humanity, about good and evil, the nature of the world, the nature of God, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to answer all of them. In part because we don't have hours and hours to sit here. I got to get you out in time for the World Cup final. But also because I don't know all the answers to those questions. In fact, I guess I would wager that many of them don't have answers, at least none that we would find to be satisfying. But what I will say is that I wonder if, just like with the story about the sower and the soil, what if we are focusing on the wrong parts of this story? Last week, we heard about the 4 different types of soil, and immediately all of our minds went to figuring out which kind of soil we were. And today we hear about the wheat and the weeds, and we do exactly the same thing. We focus on which one we are, and we start panicking over whether we are destined for the granary or the furnace. And if we are able to get past worrying about ourselves, our next inclination is just like the workers in the story, to jump into action. We want to yank out those nasty weeds and protect the precious wheat. But in the story, the master tells the workers not to worry about it, to let them grow side by side, and that he will sort it all out in the end. Why is that? Well, we're told that it's because the roots have intertwined and that by pulling up one, you will inevitably pull up the other. But I also wonder if the master doesn't tell the workers to leave them be because he's not entirely sure that they can tell the difference between which of those little sprouts will become wheat and which ones will be weeds. Could it be that the master is worried that in the process of trying to target the weeds, his workers will inevitably accidentally target some wheat as well? Is Jesus warning us about the dangers that await when we seek to assume the responsibility of passing judgment on others? If you look at the history of the church, we have not had the greatest track record when it comes to who we have chosen to condemn. Pick an era in history, and I can probably tell you about a group that was wrongly persecuted by the church. Today, my mind goes especially to the harm that the church has perpetrated against queer communities the world over. And that's in part because yesterday was the San Diego Pride Parade, where I had the great joy of marching in the Lutherans for Love contingent, along with many of you who were there both physically as well as in spirit. People often question whether it's appropriate for religious organizations to participate in pride celebrations. But I would argue that it is one of the most important places that we can show up as people of faith, in part because it provides us an opportunity to apologize to the LGBTQIA+ community for the ways that it has been treated by the church historically and in far too many cases is still treated today. Countless people throughout history who were simply living as God created them to be were told by Christians that they were less than, that they were evil, that they were weeds destined to burn for all eternity, which simply is not true. These individuals were created in God's own image, the very same as all of us. And just because we weren't necessarily the ones to inflict that harm doesn't mean that we don't have the obligation to set things right when we can, to make amends and show people what the true love of Christ looks like. Because if the role of the church is not to worry about separating the wheat from the weeds, then what is our role? Are we just supposed to sit around, twiddling our thumbs until the end of the age comes? Now, this is one of the few instances where Jesus was very clear. Our role as the church, as Christians, as followers of the way, is to love our neighbor. Amen. And as Bishop Dave Nagler wrote in his most recent newsletter article, that doesn't necessarily mean feeling something emotional. Rather, it is a commitment to one another's wholeness. We are called to desire the wholeness and the vitality of our neighbor and to work to create the conditions where those things can occur. We are called to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And part of doing justice, we do indeed need to call out injustice when we see it, but not from a position of judgment or damnation, but always from a place of love. A place that, again, desires what is best for all people and for the creation that we have been blessed with. That is what we are called to as the church. The rest, the sorting out of the wheat and the weeds, that should be left up to God. And personally, given who I know God to be, I understand the fire of which Jesus speaks to be much less of a fiery eternity in hell and much more of a refining and purifying process, an opportunity to cleanse us, cleanse all of us of those weedy parts within us, those things that separate us from God, the things that hold us back from being the people that God knows that we can be, because God is always more gracious, more forgiving, more loving than we expect or deserve. And so rather than get caught up in worrying about the wheat and the weeds and which one we are and which ones our neighbor might be, we are called instead to the work of the church, which is to love our neighbors as Jesus has loved us. Amen.